Hi, I'm Andy, and this is my lesson on removing elements from array lists in Java. In this lesson, I'll review how to remove a single element from an array list. Then I'll show you how to remove multiple elements while traversing an array list. Let's get started. Let's continue working on the student and course classes from previous lessons. In the student class, I want to add another instance variable, this one a Boolean called bill paid. This instance variable will keep track of whether or not the student has paid their bill. In the constructor, we'll assume that when a student is created, they have not yet paid their bill. We do that by setting bill paid to false. Now we'll add an accessor method called isBillPaid. And a mutator method called setBillPaid. Now let's move over to our course class. This class contains an enroll student method to add a student to the course, but it doesn't have a drop student method to remove a student from the course. Let's add one. This method will be overloaded. We'll first add a private version that will be called from only within this class. This method returns nothing and is passed a single parameter, the index of the student we want to remove. Removing a student from an array list is easy. We simply have to call the ArrayList remove method and pass along the student's index. It's important to keep in mind what happens in an array list when you remove an element. For example, suppose our array list has 5 students in it, like this. Remember, array lists contain references to objects, not the objects themselves. So this picture is not totally accurate, but it'll suffice for this analysis. If we invoke the remove method and pass 2, this student gets removed from the array list. And then the elements to the right of it are shifted over one spot. It's important to keep in mind this shifting process when using the ArrayList remove method. You'll see why later in this lesson. Now let's add the public version of the drop student method. This version will be passed a reference to the student we want to remove. The ArrayList remove method is also overloaded. So we could just call enrollStudents.remove and pass along the student here. But I want us to have a bit more control over the removal process than that, in case we want to add more steps to this process later. So instead, let's first find the student's index in the array list. Then, as long as our student was found, we can call our other version of the drop student method. If the student was not found, we'll do nothing, so we don't need an else here. Okay, now we'll use all this code we just wrote in a new course method called drop unpaid students, which will go through the enrolled students and remove any students whose bill is unpaid. This method returns nothing and has no parameters. Since we'll be modifying the array list as we traverse through it, we cannot use a for each loop here. If we did, we would get a concurrent modification exception when we tried to do the removal. Remember, only use for each loops when you want to traverse through an array or array list without modifying it at all. So we need to use a regular for loop here. In the loop body, we want to get the student at index I and then check to see if that student's bill is unpaid. If so, we want to drop that student from the course. We can call either version of our drop method, but let's use the one that gets past the student's index since that one executes less code and will therefore be a bit faster. Okay, so it looks like this method should work, but it actually doesn't. To see why, let's first go test it out so that you can see, under certain conditions, this method does not complete its task. Over in main, we'll first create 6 student objects. Then let's set 2 of the students' bill paid variable to true. We'll do that for the student at index 2 and the student at index 4. Then we'll create a course and enroll the 6 students in it. So at this point, our enrolled students array looks like this, where I've indicated the unpaid students in red. Let's print the students before removing any. Then we'll call drop unpaid students and print the list of the enrolled students again. Okay, let's see what happens when we run our program. Notice it almost worked correctly, but this student did not get dropped even though his bill is unpaid. That means there must be a flaw in our drop unpaid students method. Here's the problem. When the loop first executes, I is 0 and this student is checked. Since his bill is unpaid, he gets removed from the array list. But remember, whenever an element is removed from an array list, the elements to the right of it are shifted over one spot. Then I is incremented to 1. That means the next student checked is this one. But this student, because he shifted over into a slot we already visited, never gets checked. Thus, he never gets removed. There's a couple of ways to fix this problem. One way is to shift I backwards by 1 whenever a student is removed. That way, when I is incremented by 1, the code ends up checking the same slot as before. Another way to do it, and the way I actually prefer, is to traverse the array list in the opposite direction, from the last element down to the first element. The last element's index is 1 less than the size of the array list. And we want the loop to continue while I is greater than or equal to 0. After each time through the loop, the index needs to decrease by 1. The rest of the loop body stays exactly the same, except now we don't need this decrement statement. The reason this works better is that when we remove an element, elements to the right of it shift over. But our algorithm has now already checked those elements, so no elements will go unchecked. Okay, let's run our code and make sure it works correctly now. Good, that fixed our problem. So remember, When removing elements from an array list in a for loop, you should traverse that array list backwards, from the end to the beginning. And that wraps up this lesson on removing elements from array lists in Java. I'm Andy. Thanks for watching and coding with me today.